Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. The following manuscript was recovered from an encrypted server leak, originating from an abandoned archivist's workstation in rural Massachusetts. The gale outside howled with a desolate, inhuman timbre, battering the stained glass of St. Jude's with ice-laden air. Deep within the church's subterranean vault, miles from the nearest paved New England road, Eleanor sat wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her breath blooming in small, pale plumes. The space smelled of damp limestone, ancient tallow, and the dry, sweet decay of centuries-old parchment. It was a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic scraping of her iron fountain pen against cataloging paper and the distant, thunderous crash of winter waves against the cliffs. Eleanor was a woman governed by precision, a quiet scholar who preferred the sterile company of forgotten texts to the unpredictable noise of the living world. The diocese had hired her to organize the parish's vast, uncatalogued collection before the rotting structure was decommissioned for good. She was entirely alone, surrounded by towering oak shelves that groaned under the weight of rotting leather folios and iron-clasped hymnals. The cold here was not merely atmospheric. It seemed to leach out from the stones themselves, settling into her marrow like a slow, deliberate poison. Her desk was illuminated by a single, flickering paraffin lamp, casting long, elastic shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling. As she reached for a stack of parish birth registries from 1740, her fingers brushed against a hollow cavity beneath the altar's stone base. A sharp draft, far colder than the ambient chill of the room, seeped from the dark gap. Intrigued, Eleanor lowered her lamp, peering into the gloom. Nestled within the hidden alcove lay a small, heavy ledger, bound in dark, textured leather that felt unnaturally warm, almost feverish, against her numb fingertips. The volume lacked an author, title, or date on its spine. Its surface was scarred with faint, cross-hatched incisions, resembling crude, repetitive tally marks. When Eleanor pulled it into the lamplight, a heavy, metallic odor filled the small sphere of light, instantly cutting through the prevailing smell of old paper. It was the distinct, unmistakable tang of dried copper and old blood. She opened the volume. The pages were thick, rough-hewn vellum, filled with tight, frantic calligraphy written in dark, faded ink. The handwriting was erratic, spiking wildly across the pages as if recorded in a state of absolute terror. It was not a record of tithing or baptisms, but a meticulous ledger of unpardonable transgressions. Every entry detailed deeply personal, grotesque moral failures, penned in the first person, yet signed by different, unrecognizable initials across several decades of the 18th century. As her eyes traced the jagged lines, the silence of the vault deepened into a dense, oppressive weight. The ambient sounds of the storm outside seemed to recede, muffled as though thousands of gallons of deep water had suddenly pooled above the ceiling. The air grew thick, making it difficult to draw a complete breath. Every instinct urged her to close the book and step away, yet her academic curiosity anchored her to the wooden chair. She turned to the first entry, dated November 1782. The ink was slightly raised off the page, almost tactile. The entry spoke not of simple human failings, but of dark, internal surrenders, thoughts of profound malice, acts of secret cruelty, and a terrible, mounting realization that something within the church shadows was listening to every unspoken confession. As Eleanor read the final lines of the entry, a profound, sickening sensation took root in her chest. The temperature in the vault plummeted sharply, freezing her breath into dense white fog. The flickers of the paraffin lamp began to stretch unnaturally toward the back of the room, as if pulled by an invisible vacuum. She realized, with a sudden, icy clarity, that she was no longer merely reading history. The descriptions in the text began to mirror her own deepest, unspoken memories. guilt she had buried decades ago, rendered in exact, horrifying detail. A soft, wet scraping sound echoed from the far corner of the dark archive, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air vibrated with a faint, multitonal whisper, rising like a choir of suppressed breaths from the stone floor beneath her feet. Something ancient and unholy had recognized the opening of the ledger, and now, in the frozen silence of the subterranean vault, Eleanor felt the distinct, unmistakable sensation of 100 invisible eyes focusing upon her back. The sensation of unseen eyes pressed against Eleanor's cold skin like physical weight, heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly deliberate. She sat completely motionless at her broad wooden desk, her trembling hand hovering mere inches above the open leather ledger. The paraffin lamp flickered violently on the timber surface, its amber glow faltering dramatically against a creeping shadow that seemed to spill directly from the edges of the subterranean room. The air in the stone vault had grown unnaturally dense, smelling less of ancient parchment now and far more of fresh copper, damp soil, and the faint sweet tang of hidden decay. With a slow, trembling breath, Eleanor forced herself to turn her head toward the darkened far corner of the subterranean archive, precisely where the wet scraping sound had first originated. Nothing was visible in the gloom, only the towering oak shelves stacked high with rotting parish ledgers, standing like silent hollow sentinels in the encroaching dark. Yet, the heavy silence that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with an expectant, terrifying resonance, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Torn between an overwhelming instinctual urge to flee the premises and the hypnotic pull of the text, Eleanor looked back down at the rough vellum pages. The jagged cursive script seemed almost alive under the lamp's pale yellow flame, shifting subtly against the fiber of the sheepskin. She turned slowly to the second entry, dated December 1782. The frantic handwriting here was tighter, smaller, pressed so violently into the thick paper that the iron gall ink had bled straight through to the reverse side like a dark weeping wound. The entry was signed only with the simple initials E.V. As Eleanor scanned the jagged lines, a cold, paralyzing dread coiled tightly around her spine, leaching every trace of warmth from her limbs. The writer described a terrifying psychological deterioration, a gradual, systematic loss of ownership over their own private thoughts. The author spoke in vivid detail of hearing an incessant low-frequency hum vibrating through the heavy floorboards of the sanctuary above. It was a sound that gradually articulated itself into coherent, monstrous thoughts that were explicitly not their own. It demands an absolute accounting, the entry read in a desperate slant, not of the simple sins we confess to God before the altar, but the vile truths we bury in the dark of our own minds. Eleanor's throat tightened violently as she read the passage again, her pulse hammering against her throat. The words felt uncomfortably intimate, slicing cleanly through her academic detachment and exposing the fragile armor of her professional life. Beneath her heavy woolen boots, the stone flagstones of the ancient vault felt unnaturally frigid, as though frost were radiating directly from the deep bedrock below. As she shifted her weight against the wooden chair, a low, barely audible vibration hummed continuously through the thick leather soles of her shoes. It was subtle at first, a faint rhythmic thrumming that matched the slow, frantic cadence of her own beating heart. She reached out with a numb hand for her iron pen to note the accession number in her paper log, seeking the comfort of routine. However, as her cold fingers brushed against the polished brass barrel, the paraffin lamp sputtered sharply and died, plunging the vast vault into absolute pitch blackness. The darkness was complete, heavy, and bone-chillingly cold. Outside the stone walls, the winter storm raged on against the cliffs, but inside the subterranean chamber, the distant sound of the wind was entirely swallowed by a new sound. Rising from the aisle directly in front of her desk was the rhythmic, wet sound of slow, heavy breathing, moving closer through the pitch-black air. In the absolute gloom of the church vault, Eleanor's breath hitched violently in her chest, freezing in her throat like a lump of lead. She sat completely rigid in the suffocating darkness, every sense heightened to a painful degree as adrenaline surged through her veins. The oppressive smell of copper, wet soil, and open rot intensified dramatically, filling her nose and mouth with a metallic bitterness that made her gag. She fumbled blindly across the rough oak surface of her desk, her cold, trembling fingers searching desperately for the small box of brass matches she had left beside the cataloging sheets. Her right hand struck the metal box, knocking it off the edge to the floor. The small, sharp sound of matches scattering across cold stone echoed loudly through the cavernous chamber, followed instantly by a soft, slithering slide from the darkness just beyond her reach, as if something massive was dragging its weight across the damp flagstones directly toward her chair. "Who's there?" she whispered into the gloom, her voice sounding thin, dry, and hollow in the vast subterranean expanse. No spoken human answer came, but the air around her suddenly grew thick with an eerie multitonal whisper, a chaotic chorus of overlapping voices, muffled as though speaking through miles of wet earth and ancient limestone. The voices did not speak in English or Latin. They produced a rhythmic, clicking cadence that vibrated directly within the dense bones of her skull, threatening to shatter her focus. Desperate to break the darkness, Eleanor dropped to her knees on the stone, sweeping her gloved hands frantically across the freezing floor. Her numb fingertips brushed against a single wooden match. She grabbed it, scraped the chemical head violently against the rough edge of the stone floorboard, and a sharp flare of sulfur and blinding yellow light split the suffocating gloom. The tiny ring of flickering light illuminated the vault for a brief, fleeting second. Standing less than 3 feet from her desk was a tall, unnaturally thin figure shrouded in frayed, blackened clerical robes that hung like dead leaves. Its face was completely obscured by folds of rot-eaten linen, but where its hands should have been, long, unnaturally pale fingers stretched outward, their sharp tips stained dark with wet indelible ink and dried blood. The tiny match burned down rapidly to Eleanor's bare fingertips, scorching her skin with a sharp burst of heat, and plunged the room back into absolute pitch darkness just as the towering figure leaned forward over the desk. Eleanor scrambled backward on her hands and knees in pure terror, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs until her spine struck the cold, unyielding stone base of the altar. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she fumbled in her coat pocket, pulled out her small steel penlight, and clicked the switch button with her thumb. The thin beam of cold white light cut through the gloom, sweeping frantically across the silent room. The stone space directly in front of her broad wooden desk was completely empty. Yet, as Eleanor brought the beam of light back to her restoration desk, she saw with mounting psychological horror that the anonymous leather ledger had not remained untouched in the dark. The heavy volume lay wide open to a fresh vellum page. The dark ink upon it was glistening, thick, and completely wet, written precisely in her own distinct handwriting style. The handwritten text detailed a secret, long-buried, unforgiven memory from her early childhood, a silent cruelty that she had never spoken aloud to a single living soul in her entire life. Below the personal confession, at the bottom of the vellum page, a single final line was freshly scrawled in thick black strokes. "The penance has begun." Eleanor stared in absolute shock at the wet ink glistening on the page, the beam of her penlight trembling violently in her cold hand. The written words were undeniably hers, the distinct, forward-slanting cursive she had cultivated since girlhood, complete with the slight decorative flourish on her capital letters. Yet she had no memory whatsoever of picking up the pen, let alone dipping it into the viscous, dark fluid that now welled heavily within the porous fibers of the ancient vellum. The entry laid completely bare an incident from her 15th year, a deliberate, cruel lie that had shattered her sister's fragile life, a dark secret she had carried in absolute solitude for over 2 decades. A sickening wave of nausea washed over her, thick, suffocating, and acidic. The ambient cold in the subterranean vault had turned downright cruel, biting aggressively through her heavy wool coat and sinking into her aching joints like liquid mercury. She slammed the heavy ledger shut, the thick leather cover closing with a dense, flat thud that echoed off the damp limestone walls like a distant gunshot. Immediately, the chaotic, multitonal whispering that had filled the freezing air ceased entirely, replaced instantly by a suffocating, unnatural silence. The paraffin lamp resting on her desk suddenly flared back to life on its own, its amber wick leaping into a tall, soot-choked flame that cast long, elastic shadows. In the restored illumination, the shadows across the arched ceiling seemed to twist, stretching into long, spidery limbs that reached slowly toward the stone altar. Eleanor grabbed her heavy canvas bag, determined to sweep her cataloging notes into it and flee up the spiral stone stairs toward her truck parked above. But as she lifted her paper logbook, she noticed with mounting terror that her fingers were deeply stained. Deep, indelible black ink coated her right thumb and forefinger, seeping far beneath her fingernails as if she had been dipping her bare hand directly into a well of dye. The skin beneath the dark stain was ice cold and utterly numb, completely devoid of any physical sensation. She backed away slowly from the oak desk, keeping her wide eyes fixed continuously on the closed leather ledger. It lay motionless on the dark timber like a dead creature, yet she could see the subtle, rhythmic rising and falling of its spine, a slow, shallow motion that eerily mirrored a resting lung. The ancient building itself seemed to groan in response, the heavy oak beams above her twisting under the immense weight of the winter gale roaring outside. As she took another trembling step back toward the vault exit, her left heel struck something soft, cold, and yieldingly damp on the stone floor. She dropped her panicked gaze, expecting to find a forgotten cleaning rag or a discarded leather book binding. Instead, she found a thick, dark trail of viscous liquid winding slowly across the flagstones, emerging directly from the hidden cavity beneath the altar where she had first discovered the book. The dark fluid glistened under the flickering lamp flame, pulsing with a slow, deliberate movement that defied the natural slant of the subterranean stone floor. Eleanor felt the icy air press hard against her lungs as she realized the trail was not simply pooling, but actively crawling out from the darkness of the alcove to encircle the legs of her desk. The dark fluid seeped across the cold stone floor in a slow, deliberate thread, ignoring the natural slope of the subterranean room and creeping directly toward Eleanor's leather boots. It emitted a suffocating, unbearable odor of heavy iron, stagnation, and stale tallow incense, the distinct, unmistakable smell of a sealed crypt disturbed after centuries of rot. Eleanor forced her panicked eyes away from the glistening trail and shone her thin penlight up the narrow, winding stone staircase that led back to the church's main sanctuary. The air rising from the stone stairwell was impossibly dense, shimmering with fine suspended particles of frost that caught the beam of white light like microscopic needles. Every instinct shrieked violently at her to climb those frozen stairs, to break through the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's, and to run blindly out into the howling mountain blizzard. She took the first 3 steps frantically, her leather boots slipping slightly on the moisture-slick limestone. But as she reached the stone landing, a heavy metallic sound clanged violently overhead. The massive wrought iron storm doors at the top of the stairwell slammed shut with absolute finality. The sound of heavy deadbolts sliding into place echoed down the stone shaft, 3 distinct, thunderous thuds of solid iron grinding against iron. "No, no, no!" she gasped into the darkness, rushing up the remaining steps and hurling her full body weight against the oak door. The ancient wood did not budge even a fraction of an inch. It felt as solid and unyielding as a mountain wall. She grabbed the frozen iron ring with both hands and twisted it with all her strength, but the locking mechanism was bound tight from the outside. She hammered her fists against the frozen timber until her knuckles bled, but her frantic strikes produced only dull, muffled thuds that were instantly swallowed by the howling wind outside. From the bottom of the stairwell, deep within the dark subterranean vault she had just tried to escape, a new sound began to rise slowly. It was not the sharp storm wind or the wet slithering scraping from before. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of turning pages. Flip, flip, flip. The heavy vellum sheets of the ledger were being turned rapidly, one after another, in the absolute darkness below. Eleanor slowly turned around on the narrow stone landing, looking back down into the throat of the dark vault. The paraffin lamp on her wooden desk was still lit, casting a dim, reddish circle of flickering light against the far limestone wall. Through the arched doorway, she could clearly see the leather ledger lying open on the desk. The pages were no longer white or cream. They had turned a bruised, mottled purple, and they were flipping by themselves, faster and faster, as if caught in a violent draft that Eleanor could not feel upon her own face. Then, from the suffocating darkness surrounding the desk, a voice spoke. It did not come from a living mouth or travel through the ambient air. It vibrated directly inside the dense bones of Eleanor's inner ear, perfectly mimicking her own voice, speaking with cold, clinical precision. Page 42, November 10th. Tell us about the night in the orchard, Eleanor. The horrifying sound of her own voice echoing within her skull shattered Eleanor's remaining composure, leaving her paralyzed on the stone landing. It was not merely her cadence. It possessed the precise, measured dryness she used when lecturing or presenting her research, devoid of emotion, utterly detached, and horribly familiar to her own ears. Page 42, the voice repeated into the hollow room, a fraction louder than before, its vibration sending a sickening jolt down her spine. The orchard, the girl who never came home. Eleanor pressed her back hard against the locked iron doors of the stairwell, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped her steel penlight onto the stone steps. That night, a freezing October evening when she was barely 15 years old, was a memory she had systematically pruned from her mind, burying it deep beneath decades of academic rigor and quiet isolation. No living person on Earth knew the full truth of what had transpired. The local police had eventually ruled it a tragic wandering into the deep marshland. Her family had slowly collapsed under the immense weight of grief and suspicion, never knowing that Eleanor had held the key all along. She remembered the small bronze key she had hidden deep in the creek bed, locking the heavy orchard gate securely behind her sister after a bitter, foolish argument. Slowly, against every primal survival instinct screaming within her, Eleanor descended the winding stone stairs. Her legs felt unnaturally heavy, as though she were moving through deep, icy water that resisted her every movement. The air in the lower chamber had become so dense that each forced breath burned her throat, carrying the sharp, metallic stench of the dark, fluid pool beneath her wooden desk. The leather ledger lay open under the paraffin lamp's dying orange flare, its ancient pages silent and still. The pages had finally stopped flipping. They rested flat on the timber, the porous paper visibly drinking in the creeping shadows surrounding the desk. As Eleanor approached the threshold, her penlight illuminated the fresh text forming on the broad vellum page. The cursive script was appearing in real time, without a visible pen, without a human hand guiding the stroke. The dark, viscous fluid was seeping up directly from within the fibers of the paper itself, bubbling up like dark water through sand, forming crisp, elegant letters in her own distinct handwriting. Line by agonizing line, it laid out every horrifying detail of that long-buried night. The sound of the gate latch clicking into place, the faint crying fading slowly into the cold fog, and the small bronze key sinking into the black mud. "Stop!" Eleanor whispered frantically, her raspy voice choking on the frigid air. "Please stop." The supernatural writing did not stop for her plea. It accelerated rapidly, the letters twisting into jagged, frantic script that spilled wildly over the margins, creeping off the parchment and onto the dark oak wood of the restoration desk itself. A penance delayed is a penance compounded. The desk sang in her own cold voice, rising to a discordant multitonal chorus that vibrated through the limestone floorboards. You brought your books to this holy vault to catalog the forgotten, Eleanor. But the vault catalogs you. The dark ink on the desk surged outward like a living organism, black tendrils racing rapidly across the grain toward Eleanor's leather-bound cataloging journals, engulfing them in a tide of wet, iridescent darkness. Wherever the fluid touched paper, the historical records, centuries of parish births, marriages, and deaths, began to twist and dissolve, their text reassembling into endless iterations of Eleanor's own name and long-buried sins. Panicked and gasping for air, Eleanor reached out to shove the ledger violently off the oak desk, hoping desperately to break its terrible grip on the room. But as her gloved fingers made physical contact with the leather cover, a searing heat shot instantly up her trembling arm. The cold, numb ink stain on her right thumb pulsed with an agonizing, burning sensation, as if her skin were actively fusing directly with the binding. She pulled back with a sharp cry of agony, tearing her canvas glove completely from her hand. A patch of skin on her palm remained firmly attached to the book, revealing not blood beneath, but a dark, glistening layer of damp parchment where her flesh should have been, fine lines of black calligraphy already spidering rapidly across her raw muscle. She stared at her own open palm in absolute psychological horror. The lines written on her living skin were shifting, rearranging themselves into minute, microscopic sentences that detailed her deepest regrets. Around her, the ancient limestone vault began to physically warp and shift. The massive oak shelves groaned loudly under immense pressure, their heavy timber frames expanding into grotesque, organic arches that reached toward the ceiling. The centuries-old books stacked upon them opened simultaneously, their yellowed pages fluttering rapidly like the wings of thousands of trapped, frantic birds. From within the deep, dark spaces between the distorted shelves, tall, silent figures began to emerge into the dim light. They were not ghostly apparitions, nor simple sensory illusions born of fear. They were tall, desiccated forms clad in the tattered, rotted vestments of 18th century clergymen and long-dead parishioners, their bodies unnaturally thin and elongated, their faces entirely blank, devoid of eyes, noses, or human mouths. In place of their faces were flat, smooth surfaces of pale vellum, covered entirely in dense, frantic writing that shifted with their movement. They stepped quietly into the small radius of the paraffin light, their bare, elongated feet making no physical sound against the damp flagstones. As they moved forward, the frigid air vibrated continuously with the sound of their breath, not drawn through living lungs, but rustling dryly through the hollow pages that made up their internal structures. They formed a tight, suffocating ring around Eleanor and her oak desk, blocking every possible path to the winding stone stairwell. The figure standing at the center, the largest of them all, its blackened robes trailing in the expanding pool of dark ink on the floor, slowly raised a long, pale hand. Its fingers ended in hollow, ornate silver quills, dripping with the dark, copper-scented fluid that covered the floor. The multi-tonal voice inside Eleanor's head grew deafeningly loud, filling every dark corner of her consciousness until her own private thoughts were completely crowded out by the chorus. The ledger requires an archivist to seal the volume. The previous keeper's ink has dried. Yours is still warm. Eleanor staggered backward frantically, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the tight ring of faceless figures pressed closer and closer around her. The suffocating scent of fresh copper, wet limestone, and ancient rot choked the narrow spaces between them, filling her throat with bitter ash. Her right palm throbbingly radiated an unnatural feverish heat, the exposed patch of raw parchment skin glistening under the dying amber light of the lamp. The black calligraphy forming beneath her living flesh was actively moving, crawling up her wrist like tiny ink-black spiders, weaving intricate lines of dark text directly into her throbbing veins. "Stay back!" she gasped into the frigid air, holding her steel penlight like a weapon, its thin white beam cutting uselessly through the papery, translucent torsos of the silent figures. The tall, imposing figure in the center stepped forward over the damp floor. Its face, a smooth, featureless mask of stretched antique vellum, slanted slowly toward her trembling frame. Through the pale, translucent paper of its head, Eleanor could clearly see the faint dark silhouettes of tightly bound pages stacked inside its skull, moving and turning like the intricate gears of a subterranean clockwork mechanism. It slowly extended its long pale hand, the hollow silver quill extending from its index finger trembling with a low, hydraulic hum that vibrated through the flagstones. A thick, heavy drop of dark, iridescent ink fell from the tip of the quill, landing directly on the bare skin of the back of Eleanor's right hand. The physical pain was instantaneous, terrifying, and absolute. It was not the burning sting of fire, but an agonizing, freezing clarity that flooded her central nervous system in a violent wave. Memories, not just her own buried childhood guilt, but thousands of forgotten transgressions committed in this desolate New England town over 3 centuries, flooded her conscious mind in a blinding, agonizing flash. She saw a desperate farmer poisoning his brother's livestock in the freezing autumn of 1712, a grieving mother smothering her feverish babe in the dark, silent winter of 1745, a young, trembling minister burying a mutilated liturgical book beneath the stone altar in 1782. Every secret act, every unspoken malice that had ever been whispered in the shadow of St. Jude's surged violently through her mind, tearing through her sanity like sharp iron hooks. She fell to her knees upon the frigid flagstones, her boots splashing into the shallow pool of dark, copper-scented ink that now covered the entire subterranean floor. The faceless figures closed in tightly around her, their hollow, paper-filled chests rising and falling in perfect unison, producing a dry, rustling sound like an autumn forest whipping in a cold mountain gale. The library does not lose a page. The multi-layered voice echoed directly inside her skull, no longer just her own voice, but a deafening chorus of every soul whose sins were forever cataloged in the stone vault. Every debt is recorded in blood and ink. Every record requires a living hand to hold the pen. The central figure reached down into the gloom, its cold, ink-stained fingers gripping Eleanor's right wrist with absolute, crushing force. It forced her raw, parchment-bound palm down hard onto the open vellum page of the ancient ledger. The moment her bare skin touched the thick vellum, Eleanor's high scream was swallowed instantly by the ancient limestone vault. Her conscious mind was dragged violently down into the porous paper, fracturing her reality into thousands of dark, crystalline fragments. She was no longer merely standing in the damp subterranean archive. She was existing simultaneously within the dark, infinite, labyrinthine maze of the ledger itself. She felt her private memories being unspooled like silk threads, sorted with cold precision, categorized by unseen hands, and permanently etched into the skin-like sheepskin pages of the volume. Her entire childhood, her quiet long years of academic retreat, her unbearable grief, and her hidden lies, all were being bound into formal, elegant prose, sealed forever with the heavy, copper-scented ink. Through the blinding, suffocating haze of spiritual horror, Eleanor looked down at her free left arm with wide, unbelieving eyes. The smooth skin of her forearm was cracking open like dry wood in a summer drought, revealing thick layers of thin, cream-colored pages beneath her muscle tissue. Her warm blood was losing its vibrant crimson hue, darkening rapidly into a thick, lustrous black ink that pulsed visibly through her clear, paper-thin arteries. She realized with a terrifying, icy clarity that she was not being killed in this subterranean chamber. She was being transformed into something far more permanent. She was becoming a living binding, an eternal, selfless steward crafted by the darkness to preserve the unholy, meticulously kept record of the town's hidden moral decay. The dying paraffin lamp on the oak desk gave one final, violent flicker and died completely, plunging the freezing vault back into total darkness. Yet, miraculously, Eleanor could still perceive her cold surroundings with absolute clarity. Her altered sight no longer required physical light to function. She perceived the physical world now as sharp strokes of dark ink drawn against an infinite, pale canvas. She could see the rotting wooden structure of the church standing high above her, the decaying timbers groaning against the mountain gale, the howling blizzard outside, and deep within the frozen earth beneath her feet, the endless, sprawling subterranean vaults filled with millions of unread ledgers waiting patiently for their future archivists. The heavy, wrought iron storm doors at the top of the stone stairwell suddenly unlocked with a loud, echoey metallic clack, swinging open into the freezing New England night. The wild winter storm howled down the narrow stone shaft, carrying with it the fresh, sharp scent of pine needles and salt air from the distant sea. On the broad restoration desk, the heavy leather ledger slowly closed itself, its calfskin cover sealing behind an iron latch with a soft, definitive snap. Eleanor stood up from the freezing stone flagstones of the floor, her movements smooth, soundless, and entirely devoid of human friction or effort. She picked up the heavy iron fountain pen from her desk, her long, unnaturally pale fingers wrapping around the brass barrel with practiced, mechanical precision. She set the bound book back into the dark hollow cavity beneath the stone altar, sliding it deep into the narrow gap where it would rest until the next unsuspecting scholar arrived to clear the parish archives. She sat back down in the dark wooden chair, resting her paper hands flat upon the desk, her face smooth, quiet, and completely featureless beneath her heavy wool hood. She closed her eyes, or what had once been her human eyes, and settled into the deep, suffocating, eternal silence of the vault, waiting patiently for the heavy oak doors above to open once again. The ancient limestone vault was no longer a place of mere physical stone and mortar. It had become an architecture woven entirely from forgotten human confessions. Eleanor sat completely motionless behind the broad oak restoration desk, her altered vision rendered in sharp, monochromatic contrasts of pure ivory and pitch blackness. Though the paraffin lamp resting on the desk was long dead, the subterranean room glowed with a faint, bioluminescent radiance emitted by the wet ink tracing through her exposed, paper-thin veins. Her mind, once a solitary sanctuary of quiet scholarship and academic detachment, was now an open corridor through which 300 years of human decay echoed endlessly. Above her frozen body, the structural decay of St. Jude's accelerated rapidly with the roaring storm. She could feel the heavy oak beams in the main sanctuary splintering under the immense weight of the blizzard outside, not with the dry crack of dying timber, but with the wet, agonizing sigh of tearing cartilage. The ancient stone walls of the subterranean chamber began to soften dramatically, the damp limestone shifting into thick, compacted layers of old parchment, damp with the cold sweat of forgotten penitence. She looked down slowly at her transformed hands resting flat upon the wood. The skin of her fingers had fully turned to smooth, translucent vellum, fine black script spiraling rapidly up her wrists in tight, intricate geometric bands. She was no longer breathing human air. In place of the natural rhythmic expansion of her living lungs, a faint, papery rustling sounded continuously within her hollow chest, the silent, endless turning of parchment pages deep inside her ribcage. A sudden sound broke the cold, suffocating stillness of the lower vault. The distant crunch of tires on heavy ice, far up on the road above the church, followed by the muffled slam of a car door. Eleanor's heightened senses stretched rapidly outward, shooting up through the rotting floorboards like fine roots of wet black ink. She felt the heavy, hesitant footsteps of a newcomer crossing the snow-covered threshold of the main sanctuary far above. It was a young man, his pulse rapid, shallow, and erratic, his troubled mind heavy with the distinct, metallic tang of a fresh, hidden guilt. He was a new parish caretaker, sent by the distant diocese to investigate why the lone archivist had suddenly stopped responding to routine radio calls. "Eleanor?" A trembling voice called out from the dark top of the stone stairwell, sounding thin, frail, and hollow against the vast expanse of the ruined nave. Are you down there? Eleanor did not make a single physical move, yet her unnatural presence expanded up the spiral stone stairs like a slow-moving cloud of thick soot. The freezing space around her stirred with quiet, monstrous anticipation. The faceless figures standing in the shadows leaning forward in perfect unison, their paper-filled chests rising in a silent, collective intake of frigid air. The slow, heavy footsteps above moved carefully down the spiral stone steps, each deliberate strike of a rubber boot echoing like a rhythmic heartbeat against the papery walls of the stairwell. Fragile flashlight beam fragments cut nervously through the suffocating subterranean darkness, yellow, flickering, and frail, only to be completely swallowed by the deep, absorbent blackness of the ancient limestone vault. Eleanor? The mountain storms knocked out the main road entirely. We need to leave right now, the man's quivering voice called out, sounding closer now, hovering just beyond the arched entryway. He stepped slowly into the freezing subterranean chamber, his rapid breath coming in thick, white, frantic puffs that dissolved into the frigid air. His bright beam of white light swept frantically across the towering, empty oak shelves, the overturned brass inkwells, and finally locked onto the heavy wooden restoration desk standing at the quiet center of the room. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the deep, suffocating shadow cast behind the dead paraffin lamp. To his untrained eyes, she appeared merely as a quiet, dedicated scholar shrouded in a heavy dark wool coat, her hooded head bowed in deep concentration over her late-night archival work. Jesus, Eleanor, didn't you hear a word I said? He took 3 hesitant steps forward over the flagstones, his rubber boots splashing heavily into the shallow, dark liquid pooling continuously across the cold floor. He paused instantly, lowering his heavy metal flashlight to look down at his wet feet, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as the sharp, copper stench of the stagnant fluid reached his nose. What on earth is all this? Has a water pipe burst somewhere above us? He reached out a gloved right hand toward her slumping shoulder, seeking to shake her awake from her trance. Eleanor, however, the very moment his gloved fingers made physical contact with the rough fabric of her coat, the heavy wool garment collapsed inward like hollow ash. The empty coat fell limply to the stone floor in a meaningless heap of frayed, rotted cloth. Standing erect on the wooden seat of the chair was only the open leather ledger, its broad vellum pages wide, wet, and glistening with fresh, dark, iridescent ink. The man gasped in pure terror, scrambling violently backward across the room. But the deep pool of black ink beneath his feet surged rapidly upward like living grease, binding his heavy boots firmly to the frigid flagstones. The massive wrought iron storm doors at the dark top of the stone stairwell slammed shut once more with a deafening, final clang that shook the entire subterranean foundation. From the suffocating darkness surrounding the oak desk, Eleanor's voice, now terrifyingly layered with 100 overlapping, paper-thin tones, emerged smoothly from the empty air. Page 84, October 4th. Tell us about the deliberate fire, Thomas. Thomas's heavy metal flashlight dropped violently from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the frozen stone and illuminating the shifting, featureless faces of the pale figures that materialized directly from the damp walls. The frigid air within the subterranean chamber grew instantly ice-cold, his raw, frantic terror actively feeding the ancient, unholy mechanism of the vault like heavy oil poured onto a dying ember. As his desperate, frantic screams began to break down into the rhythmic, multi-tonal cadence of the subterranean room, Eleanor observed the horrors from everywhere at once. She was no longer bound by a physical human frame. She was the dark ink soaking deep into his heavy leather boots, the cold dampness of the ancient limestone walls, and the invisible hand turning the heavy vellum pages of the ledger. She felt his private secrets unspooling like silk threads, his deeply buried atrocities being catalogued with cold, immaculate, mechanical precision, transforming rapidly into permanent, dark lines drawn across the broad vellum pages of the open book. Her official work as a hired archivist was finally complete, yet her true purpose had only just begun in the dark. Deep beneath the stone foundation of St. Jude's, beneath the tangled roots of the snowbound pine trees and the ancient New England granite bedrock, the true subterranean library stretched out endlessly into the suffocating dark, miles of hidden vaults filled with millions of unread ledgers, waiting in absolute, bone-chilling silence for the forgotten sins of the living world to be brought down into the shadows. The dark, copper-scented ink on the ledger's latest broad page slowly dried into a permanent, dark finish against the ancient parchment. The heavy vellum pages turned once more on the oak desk with a soft, papery rustle, settling flat on a completely blank sheet of pristine, pale vellum. And in the heavy, suffocating silence that followed, the subterranean vault settled back into its eternal, watchful rest, waiting patiently for the next hesitant step upon the winding stone stairs above. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.